This is going to be a lesson on R Markdown. R Markdown is a feature that's available to everyone in RStudio. It's another way to write and execute code that's a little bit different from what we've done before. And the big advantage of R Markdown is that it lets you write reports that have both text and code integrated together into the report. So it looks visually easier to read and more pretty than if we were to just type code and add comments, which are kind of hard to read sometimes. So I will share the screen. All right, so on the screen, you should be seeing an empty RStudio. And so to get started with R Markdown, we start pretty similarly to how we start with just a regular R script. I'm gonna go to this little plus button up here that lets me create a new script or a new file. But this time when I click on it, instead of clicking new R script, I'm gonna actually go down here and click R Markdown. So what I'm doing is I'm clicking this new button, this plus button, and then I'm selecting R Markdown. It's going to pop up a options window here. And so we're going to go ahead and fill this in. You want to create a title for your document. So I'm going to call this R Markdown lesson. And then author's name and date. We can adjust or remove these later on, but for now, let's just leave them. And then this is kind of an important selection here. So it's going to ask me when I create my report, what kind of file do I want to generate? Do I want to create an HTML file, a PDF file, or a Word file? Now, when I'm working in R Markdown, I typically select PDF. That's the type of file I'm most commonly interested in creating. That being said, in order to create PDFs using R Markdown, you have to install something called MikTeX or MacTeX on your computer. So you can see they gave us a note here. PDF output requires text. MikTeX on Windows, MacTeX 2013 plus on OS X, right? So unless you have this on your computer already, which I'm guessing most of you probably don't, then selecting PDF is not going to work. Now, you can go look into that. I'll provide some resources in case in the future you're interested in creating PDFs. But for today, we're going to stick with HTML format. HTML format allows us to open the report in a web browser like Chrome or Safari. And we don't need to install anything additional to use HTML format. So we're going to stick with HTML format. And so I'll click OK. So it pops open a new tab here. At the top, we have a section that's enclosed in these little 3 dashes at the top, 3 dashes at the bottom. This is called our heading. Our heading is going to contain kind of the basic information that's going to go at the top of our report. So our title that we selected, the author, and the date. I'll show later on how we can manipulate this if we want to. I mean, I can already manipulate this. So for example, if I wanted to type out my full name, I could do that. If I wanted to edit my title, asynchronous lesson, R Markdown, I can do that. No problem there. But we can also remove some of these things if we want to, and I'll show that later on. So let's take a look at what they've given us. When you create a new R Markdown document, they actually give you a little tutorial just in case you don't know how to use R Markdown or you have forgotten how to use R Markdown. Even as someone who's been using RStudio and R Markdown for a long time, I still find the tutorial helpful. So the first thing they give us is a setup chunk of code. we're going to leave that alone. That needs to stay there for now. And then they give us some text. They say, this is in our Markdown document. Markdown is a simple formatting syntax for authoring HTML, PDF, and MS Word documents. So this is kind of our little tutorial that they're going to give us. We're going to, in a moment, we're going to delete all this because we don't really want this as part of our report, but it's here to help remind us kind of how our Markdown works. And we'll see this in a moment, but we have our header that I mentioned already, and then we have a little chunk of code that's a setup chunk that we're not going to touch. And then these parts that are just against a white background, these are text. So when we create the report, these are going to show up as just kind of like nice text, like in a PDF document or a Word document. These parts that are against a gray background are code chunks. So these are going to show up as code. And they'll be formatted nicely so that it's readable within the report. And you can actually mess around with your code chunks using this little play button here. So when I mouse over that play button, it says run current chunk, right? These are called code chunks. And so, for example, in this chunk, I see that we're executing a summary cars command. So this is I think it's supposed to be the empty cars data set. Let's see what happens when I hit play. Okay, so it's actually, I think, a different data set than empty cars. It has speed variable and a distance, perhaps, variable. And it gives me the summary, right? And when I run that, it pops open a little window down here that shows me the output. So rather than going down and looking at my console, and I can look at the console, right? Here it did the same thing down in the console, so I can look down there if I want. But a lot of times when I'm working, I find it's easier to just look at the little pop-down window that pops up right here. If for some reason I don't want to see that anymore, I can exit out here and it goes away. And then I can run the code again and it pops up again. So I'm going to show you now what happens when we create the document or knit the document. Knitting is the term for kind of like compiling or generating the HTML or PDF or Word document that we are working on here. So before I do that, I'm going to actually save this thing that I'm working on, because even though it's got all this stuff, I can see up here that it's still called Untitled 1 and it's red. So let's go ahead and save it somewhere. So I'm going to hit save. And then just like normal, I need to find a spot where I want to put this. And before I hit save, I just want to point out that normally our R scripts are saved as .r files. When we work with our Markdown files, they are saved as .rmd files. So that's a little different. So I'll hit save. And now that it's saved, I'm going to try hitting this knit button, which should generate my document. When I hit this, it opens up a new tab down here called the render tab, and it starts doing all this stuff. And for the most part, I just ignore all this stuff. And then when it finishes, it pops open a preview or a look at what I created. And so I can see at the top here, this is my title that I wrote, this is my author name, and this is the date. And then here's kind of my first big heading. And then this is the tutorial that they, put in there. Here's summary cars, and here's what comes out when you do summary cars. So again, I didn't write all this. This is just their tutorial. But I want to quickly show some correspondence between what's present in the tutorial and what we see in our R Markdown document, what's present in this output and what we see in our R Markdown document, because the tutorial has some kind of like hints about how to do things. So for example, I noticed that this R Markdown text is much bigger. It's acting as a heading, right? And if I look back at my original RMD document right here, this R Markdown is set off with 2 hashtag or pound symbols. And so that tells me in this tutorial, it tells me, oh, that's how I make a heading. If I want to have a big heading on my document, I'll just have to use 2 hashtag or pound symbols to do that. Let me see if I can get my preview to pop back up again. 1 second. Here we go. Another thing I notice in the output here, they've put a link in here. Here's a link. How do we do a link in R Markdown? Well, I can let me get my Zoom window set up a little better here. 1 second. All right, there we go. So how do we do a link? Well, here is an example of a link. It looks like they enclosed it in little caret symbols. Another thing I see in the output, here's something in bold. When you click the knit button, a document will be generated. How did they do bold on that word knit? Well, if I look back at my RMD document, here it is. They put 2 stars around the word knit. So there's some little tips or tidbits in the tutorial that can help you get started and help remind you, even if you've done this before, help remind you, oh yeah, that's how you do bold. That's how you do a link. Of course, you can also Google it. And Google is very helpful when working with R Markdown. Also, sometimes we rely on cheat sheets, and I will provide a cheat sheet later on, just so that you have a quick reference, because you don't want to use space in your brain to memorize how to make things bold in R Markdown. You just want to Google it real quick or look at your cheat sheet, because it's quirky. It's a little different. So, all right. So that gives us an idea of what we're making. So now, because I really don't want their tutorial, I'm going to start here in line 12, and I'm going to delete everything. So I just highlighted everything, and I'm going to hit backspace. And what am I keeping? I'm keeping my heading up here. We need that for sure. And I'm keeping my little setup code. We need that for sure. But other than that, I can start with a blank slate here.